Dr. Orion Kale had learned to count storms the way sailors once counted waves. On Kepler 9.1b, tempests grew like thoughts, sudden, electric, and often poisonous. He could tell, by the taste of iron rising on his tongue and the faint violet sheen creasing the horizon, that he had at most 7 hours before the acid squalls would roll in like a choir of teeth. Rover. Mark Vector. His voice came steady through the suit. Grid J12. Adjust to compensate for washout. The rover is skeletal. 6-wheeled frame with a belly like a beetle's hummed in obedience. The terrain sloped away into red stone terraces as though a giant had bitten the land into steps and left the chips where they fell. Above, the sky wore a permanent bruise, maroon at the edges, ochre at zenith. A slow swirl of particulate haze that turned the sun into a white coin. Orion's HUD tracked wind shear, radiation spikes, and oxygen debt. He should have turned back an hour ago. He did not. Curiosity was a disease in his line of work. So was solitude. Just 20 more minutes, he murmured, more to himself than the rover. The mineral readings are peaking. Either we found a hematite garden or he trailed off, or something else, something worth the extra hour. Kepler 91b had a reputation as a paper planet, valuable in theory, unwilling in practice. The atmospheric chemistry played badly with human lungs without a scrubber mask. Its storms etched glass and scoured paint from hulls. The settlement agency had stamped it with a provisional resource point, then promptly forgot about it. Orion hadn't. He had a small grant, a smaller outpost, and a talent for getting overlooked. He crested a ridge. The horizon broke open with a smear of bright silver wedged into the red slope below. Like a knife in a loaf, vapor curled from the lesion in the earth. His HUD chirped. Thermal anomaly, 42 Celsius climbing. Composition unknown, Orion's breath caught. Not hematite, not wind-carved stone. Visual mark, he whispered. A habit he hadn't spoken to another human face-to-face in 112 days. The suit translated the words to a log entry and tucked it away with the rest. He guided the rover down the ridge with slow care. Fine dust lifted around the wheels, hanging in the air like ink in water. As he drew close, the shape resolved, a pod, sleek and ovate, a surface like brushed mercury interrupted by thin articulation seams. Impact scars blackened one flank, crumpling metal around a blown hatch. Symbols curving, elegant glinted in pale relief along the collar. Not human, not any catalogued partner civilization his memory supplied. He parked the rover 30 meters away and ran the standard protocols anyway, as though standard applied to this moment. Radiological scan, clean. Pathogen sweep, ambiguous. The board blinking a patient orange that meant we don't know. But we hope. He told himself that was good enough and moved. He approached the pod at a crouch. The suit's servos whined softly. At the knees he'd been meaning to grease them. He laid a gloved palm against the hull. Warm, as if alive. A faint hum vibrated his bones. Through the ruptured hatch he could just make out the interior. Seat, harness. Smooth alcoves for equipment. A plasma scoring pattern near the forward consoles. More symbols. No familiar toggles or levers. The interface looked grown, not assembled. He aimed his helmet lamp inside. A figure lay half-curled on the deck, small against the pod's slick perfection. For a heartbeat Orion thought he saw water, moving light, pooled color. Then the figure shifted and a thin hand spasmed against the floor. He swore softly and clambered in. Careful of shards. He thought she. The form registered as feminine. To his human eye was tangled in a webbed restraint, half out of a pressure suit that clung to her like damp skin. The suit was torn at the side. A sheen of translucent fluid had gelatinized across the gap and cracked in delicate fractures like ice. Her skin shone with a faint inner luminescence, dark violet threaded with clearer lines that pulsed like veins of light. For fingers, long and webbed to the second joint, trembled against the deck. She wore nothing on her head. The structure there was not hair in the human sense, but drifts of fine, transparent filaments that shifted with each breath, catching his lamp and sending it back in tiny rainbows. Her eyes opened. They were large, lidless, a luminous gold irised with soundless ripples. They locked on Orion's faceplate, on the human silhouette reflected there. Her mouth moved. A hiss, a syllable that snapped like glass. He couldn't parse it. "Hey," he said, every protocol bunched behind that one small word. "Hey, I'm a physician. I'm not here to hurt you." He thumbed his suit to external audio, letting the speakers cast his voice into the pod's stale air. The filaments above her skull flickered once. She tried to sit up, failed. He slid an arm under her shoulders, testing weight, balance. Too light, brittle as though bone density were lower than human. "Let's get you out of here." He felt for a pulse where one might be on a human neck, wrist. Nothing there. He set to fingertips along a glowing vein at her clavicle. A slow thrum answered. Alive, but falling. The ripped suit was leaking faint vapor. Orion's HUD chirped again. Environment inside the pod, 0.86 atmospheres, high argon. Traces of ammonia low enough to sting human sinuses, but not immediate tissue damage. Oxygen, almost none. The pod must have been cycling something else for her. Out here, outside the pod, she had minutes, maybe. He checked her mouth. No obvious obstructions. The filaments along her head retracted at his touch, not defensively, but reflexively. Like sea anemones withdrawing from a wave. The inner luminescence of her skin dimmed. Right, he said to the air, to his own thundering pulse. He slid his arm under her knees, careful of the torn suit, and lifted. She weighed less than he feared and more than he expected. The kind of paradox that meant he was thinking too fast to be precise. He backed out of the pod, ducking the jagged hatch. Lowering her onto a field stretcher he'd dragged from the rover. She said something again, 3 syllables this time, like wind through a reed. His suit translated nothing. He'd left the xenolinguistics package offline, back at the outpost. It drew power and memory he needed for geological mapping. He felt stupidly grateful for the oversight. There was something intimate about her words hitting him raw. "Save your strength," he said, because humans said that to each other in emergencies, and he had no better phrase. The drive back to the outpost took 27 minutes. He made it in 19. He radioed ahead to nothing, out of habit. There was no one on this planet but him and the old relay that sent his weekly logs. To a board administrator on Mars who skimmed, stamped received, and went to lunch. The rover bucked once over a stone lip, and he threw an arm out to steady her. The filaments brushed against his forearm plate and left a fine dusting of light like pollen. Inside the outpost, the ordinary things took on obscene clarity. The enamel mug on the countertop. The picture stuck to the wall with tape a storm over Lake Superior. The last vacation he took with his sister before she enlisted. The green light that meant the scrubbers were doing their job. He shouldered the hatch closed, hit the cycle, heard the air thicken into Earth normal with a sigh like relief. He moved without thinking now, falling into the choreography that had once saved human lives in emergency rooms. Wrapped in white tile and fluorescent boredom, triaging an alien in a prefab lab was different in its details. But the rhythm of care was the same. Assess, stabilize, improvise, repeat. He cut away the ruined suit with a laser scalpel. The smell hit first, not blood, not exactly, but a metallic sweetness edged with the tang of ozone. The tear along her side exposed a web of translucent fascia beneath that pulsed faintly. A living architecture like spun glass. He closed it with a bioglue patch, one designed for human dermal layers, but adhesion was adhesion. The glue took, the pulse under the fascias strengthened. "We're going to try an O to bleed," he said, narrating for the sake of his own mind, for the recording that might one day be someone else's lifeline. He rigged a cuff from a flexible respirator, fashioning a seal over her nose and mouth. He dialed the oxygen low at first, watching the monitor for CO displacement patterns. Her chest rose and fell. The filaments above her skull fanned slightly, then expanded, as if inhaling with her. His monitors didn't know what to make of her. He read the map of her color instead, the way her skin brightened. The hissing in her throat softened. She shivered. He wrapped her in a thermal blanket and linked the medbed to his suit's telemetry. A mistake he'd made once, years ago, was assuming warmth worked the same for everyone. The patient had been human, and he had misread the signal of a failing thyroid for shock. He had time to think about that now, and how little time he had to think at all. Saline equivalent. He muttered, "Except what's equivalent to what?" He chose the safest planet, isotonic solution, microdose. The vein-like channels near her wrist glimmered in response. He threaded a line under the luminescent skin, felt the slightest give, the faintest pull, the clinical intimacy that told him, even across species, that he had found a path. Minutes opened into a small forever. Machines hummed the way they hum in any decent clinic, indifferent and steady. Outside, wind ticked the siding with a sound like fingernails. A red planet held its breath. She woke a little at a time. First her eyes fluttered in slow thirds, the gold-banded iris narrowing, then widening. The filaments lifted, as if listening. Her hands flexed. Her fingers ended in soft pads rather than nails. The webbing between the middle two shivered like a sail. She turned her head with an effort and looked at him. For the first time, Orion saw not a biological event, but a person. It landed in his chest like a second heartbeat. He popped his faceplate. This was the riskiest moment. Exchanged air, exchanged germs. The beginning of every bad story about first contact gone wrong. He'd scrubbed the room with UV. He'd cycled the air 3 times. He'd glittered his hands in antiseptic until his skin felt tight. It would have to do. He wanted her to see eyes, not mirrors. Her gaze caught on his face. Her pupils, if that's what they were, contracted. He saw recognition, or its raw material, move across her expression like clouds. "I'm Orion," he said. Words felt stupid. He tried again, touching the fingertips to his chest like a child miming. "Orion." She watched his fingers, then mirrored the gesture with one of her own hands, tapping her sternum lightly. "HFY Era," she said, the syllables broken, as if she were splicing her word to fit his mouth. Her voice came rough and melodious at once, a flute with a crack. "Liara," he repeated, and the way relief washed through him should have embarrassed him. He smiled, and the corners of her mouth tilted in response, a blink and miss hybrid of smile and reflex. She reached up and touched the edge of the respirator mask. He lifted it gently away, bringing it back when her breath hitched. He adjusted the mix, folded reality into small tasks. Her skin brightened, then steadied into a deeper tone he was beginning to recognize as baseline. She spoke again, slower, shaping each sound as if it were a careful gift. He caught a word that wasn't a word in any human language, and then wonder of wonders too in universal standard. The Creole engineered into most trade and science fleets. "Ship, hurt." "Yes," Orion said, and he pointed toward the door as if through it lay the whole alien wreck, and beyond it the unhelpful sky. "Ship crashed." "You crashed." "You're safe." "Safe," she tried, the S dragging like silk on stone. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again, urgent now, and made a motion near her temple with 2 fingers splayed, and then closed, a gesture like shutting something delicate. She repeated it, faster. "SHH purse, purse." She made a cutting motion. "Take, take." She fumbled for the standard word and failed. She pointed at the torn patch at her side, then at the door, then at herself. "Pirates." Orion guessed. The word was older than most of their tech. He felt suddenly absurd, standing in a repurposed shipping container on a marginal world, swapping pantomimes with a person whose ancestors had perhaps seen stars that would never show their faces to human eyes. And yet the word fit to her motion, to the scoring inside the pod that looked wrong for an accident. "Pirates attacked." Liara nodded, relief and grief sharing a face. "Yes," she said. She tried to sit up, and pain snapped over her features like a short-lived storm. Orion put a hand on her shoulder. The skin there felt warmer than human, smooth. A surface tension sensation like touching water held in shape. "Easy, please," he added. And because he believed in the placebo effect of kindness, he let his voice soften into it. "You need rest." "I need to check for internal." He gestured foolishly at his own ribs. "Inside hurt." Liara's gazed at that ripple thing again. "Inside, less hurt," she managed. "You help," he breathed. Something unclenched in his jaw he hadn't known he was holding. He set the medbed to gentle diagnostic, tuned 3 settings by intuition. He hoped approximated sense. He dimmed the lights. He stepped back for a moment and made himself look around the room through her eyes. The cotton blankets patched at the edges, the mismatched mugs, the field guides on a shelf with words in a script she could not read. He'd been living in a nest of function for months. Now, with another mind laid within its lines, he wanted it to be a place, not just a station, "I'm going to call for help," he said, although he knew what answer waited over the calm silence, or at best a delay measured in weeks. "There's a relay in orbit. I'll send a packet." He raised his hand, finger and thumb almost touching. "Small chance someone responds fast," Liara's expression stilled. "Small chance," she said softly, tasting the shape of each consonant. She turned her face toward the ceiling, toward the panels that hummed like distant bees, the filaments above her skull, and again he wondered if they were sensory organs, if they drank the air the way reef creatures drank currents. He wondered how many wonders he could store before he dropped something. "You rest," he repeated. And this time, when he stepped away, she let him dot in the calm alcove. He slotted in the emergency tag he'd never expected to use. His voice recorded calm and clear, "Unknown vessel down. One survivor. Non-human, sapient, injured but stabilized. Signs of hostile engagement. Request medical and security support. Coordinates attached. Kepler 9-1b. He sent the packet and watched the little icon crawl across the status line. Ran a checksum he didn't need but wanted. Sent it again. He set the system to squawk every hour with an update. He imagined a board administrator glancing at the flag and sitting up very fast. He imagined no one hearing at all. Between those two images stretched a road he did not control. He went back to the place where he did. Liara slept. If that's what to call the stillness, breath slow and even, skin tone steady. Filaments flattened like grass in calm wind. Orion sat in the chair by the bed and let the adrenaline recede. The way an ocean draws down after a surprise wave. The crash played back in his head in loops, intercut with memories he'd thought filed. A boy learning how to stitch on a banana peel, the peel bruising under clumsy thread. A young doctor on an orbitaler catching a hand mid-fall as the light went out of someone's eyes. His sister laughing behind a fogged-up windshield as they outran a Midwestern thunderstorm that turned the road into a sheet of nails. He had positioned his life at the far edge of human traffic. Because solitude made sense to him, quiet was a kind of truth. He had not, apparently, moved his heart quite so far. After an hour he checked her wound again. The bioglue had set like clear lacquer. The tissue beneath was knitting in intricate laces that would have made any of his old surgeons weep with envy. He recorded the process with his ocular implant, muttering notes for later. Regenerative matrix appears semi-crystalline. Electrical potential across the wound interface suggests bioelectric patterning. Future, do not touch without ground strap. He smiled at himself. Future research plans were a comfort food. She woke in tiny increments again. He offered water, just a droplet at a time, on her lower lip, and watched as her mouth learned the trick of it, the way an infant learns that a spoon can be friend not foe. He warmed nutrient broth and thinned it until it was almost vapor, and let her breathe it in. Through the respirator's moisture port, she said a word that might have been thanks or might have been his imagination, wearing gratitude as a disguise. "How long?" she said, and then stopped, a furrow passing through the gold of her eyes. "How long storms?" 7 hours before the next one, Orion answered. The question surprised him with its practicality. "We have time. I'm not leaving you to go sightseeing." Her mouth twitched again. Sightseeing. She tasted the phrase, the way humans taste a fruit from a visitor's bag. "You alone?" She gestured around with her fingertips, the smallest movement like a dancer's economy. "Yeah," he said. He said it lightly, though sometimes it had weight. "Just me, Rora Station 8, population 1. I wasn't expecting company." He hesitated, then added, "I'm glad you're here. Though I wish the circumstances were different." She blinked slowly. "Glad," she repeated, and this time the smile rose more clearly. A tilt of the mouth and a softening of the eyes that read universal. "I am alive because—" "Orion." He looked away then, not because he was ashamed of the heat in his face, but because looking at it full on might crack something that had been held tight for too long. He busied his hands with the edges of a blanket that did not need straightening. "Do you have kin?" he asked after a moment, the question clumsy and necessary. "Others who will look for you?" Liara's gaze slid to the ceiling again, as if the answer hung there. For a heartbeat he thought she would say nothing. Then, "Yes," she said. The word was a breath. "If they live." He thought of the scoring in the pod. The word pirates hanging like a blade in the air, the broken symbols in silver along the hatch. He thought of the human habit of finding the worst story and then making it true. He tamped it down. "Then we will help them find you," he said. And if the "we" stumbled off his tongue a little, he did not apologize. "That's a promise." Liara watched him for a long, quiet moment, something measuring and unguarded in her gaze. Then she nodded once. The filaments above her skull fanned and fell, like a sigh that travels through grass. The storm announced itself with the softest of knocks, a shift in pressure, a trembling in the walls like a harp string plucked. Orion checked the exterior feeds. The sky had bruised further into a deep whine. The dust was rising. He ran a systems check, a ritual, a rosary of buttons, and clicked the outpost into storm mode. Panels sealed, vents narrowed. The old machine braced its bones and pretended it was a ship at sea. He returned to the chair. Liara slept again, or went into whatever her people did in the hours between crisis and dawn. He let his eyes half close and felt the strange braid of fatigue and alertness that follows adrenaline. If he slept, his brain would play bad cinema on the back of his eyelids. If he stayed awake, it would script new ones. He compromised with a light doze, his hand near the bed rail, his mind hovering in the foyer between rooms. He dreamed not of storms or pods, but of glass gardens, towers of translucent coral, rising from a dark sea, each with a pulse like a heartbeat. He dreamed of voices like bells rung underwater, and of a hand with four fingers reaching for his across a narrow gulf. He woke to the sound of the outpost singing. It sang when the wind hit just so, a low harmonic that made the floor vibrate. He took a second to admire the music. He'd learned to like it. It reminded him he was small and the world was big. And then he realized there was a second note braided with it. Liara was humming. It might have been singing. It might have been breath passing across a structure in her throat that human bodies did not own. It braided with the outpost's hum, found it, matched it, then shifted half a note up until the harmony made Orion's skin pebble with goose flesh. When she opened her eyes, the sound dissolved like salt in water. "Storm," she said. Not a question. "Storm," he agreed. She reached for the edge of the bed and tried to push herself up. He put a palm out in caution. She mimed patience with a flick of fingers, the gesture so human in its exasperated tenderness that he laughed despite himself and let him guide her to a sitting position. The respirator hissed gently. She looked toward the small window slit set with a pane of chemically toughened quartz. Outside, the air had turned to red silk shredding itself. "Beautiful," she said softly. The standard word, sudden and sure. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Sometimes it just eats things." He tapped the corner of the tray table. "You're safe in here, though. The station's built to take it." He paused, then added, because he had promised himself he would not keep his universe too small anymore. "And I'm glad you can see it. People should see the things I've seen out here." Liara's gaze slid back to him. "You see alone," she said. "Not now." She touched her sternum lightly again. "Liara, not alone." She shaped her fingers into the earlier gesture near her temple, and then returned them to her chest, the motion like a vow. He did not know her customs, her hierarchy, her history. He knew 1,000 things he did not know, but he understood a contract when it landed in his lap dressed as gratitude. He had signed many documents in his life, stipends, non-disclosure agreements, consent forms. None felt as binding as the simple human and more than human fact that another living creature had placed their life in his hands and then, when it no longer belonged to the cliff's edge, chosen to keep it near him anyway. "Not alone," he echoed, and let the words take up residence in the outpost like an additional piece of furniture. If he had been a different man, he might have called the moment fate. If he had been younger, he might have called it luck. Orion called it the logical consequence of two moral vectors intersecting in a hostile environment. Choose to help, choose to trust. Simple arithmetic. He liked that his heart gave the calculation a flourish at the end that logic did not account for. He spent the next 2 hours oscillating between nurse and scientist. He adjusted the oxygen mix by hairline turns based on the way her skin's internal glow waxed and waned. He took samples of the fluid that had gelled over her wound and fed them to the outpost's old gene sequencer, which wheezed and coughed and pretended to know what it was looking at. He found a repeating structure in the sample. that made no sense to him, an array that looked like a memory lattice more than a protein motif, and marked it for long study. He grounded himself with small axe, cleaned the tray, boil instruments, write notes with a pen that skipped on the page because it was cold in the lab. Liara ate for more spoonfuls of steam, and then, having mastered the art of sip without gag, half a cup of broth. She tested each new act carefully, the way a dancer tests a floor before a leap. She asked him the names of object, stray, light, window, mug, and repeated them with care. When she asked for the word for herself again, he told her Liara and watched the name soften on her tongue. He found he liked the way she said his. Orion, she said, and somehow the syllables picked up a small shine they had not had when his mother said them, or his professors, or the man on the intercom calling late rent. He told himself it was the novelty of a non-human voice. He did not entirely believe himself. At last, the storm tired of its tantrum and went to bother a different part of the planet. The outpost let out a long sigh and relaxed its seals. A thin beam of clean white watered the wall. The routine reassembled itself around the moment and walked forward, wearing its ordinary clothes. Orion stood. "I need to go back to your pod," he said. "There may be information we need. A beacon, a black box, something I can pull before the wind sands it into art." Liara's filaments stiffened. "You go alone?" She did not attach fear to the words. She attached something like knowledge. "This is what he does. Just to the ridge and back." He promised. 20 minutes. The rover's fast. He nodded toward the medbed monitors. "If anything changes, the station will rabble me back." He mimed the station grabbing him by the sleeve, a pantomime that crossed the line from silly into universal. She smiled. He found that he had been fishing for that. Liara's fingers brushed his wrist, a feather of contact that would have been inconsequential, if not for the way it lit up every nerve between skin and spine. She touched the inside of his wrist, where a human pulse beat, and her fingers made a silent circle just above it. "Return," she said, and for the first time she gave an instruction rather than a description. "Return," he echoed solemnly. "I will." He went. Then, before he could teach himself fear, the rover's motor whirred a little hoarsely. He should have serviced it last week. He took the direct route, coaxed the engine over the terraces, watched the glassy dust rise in thin plumes and settle. The pod lay where he'd left it, half swallowed, its hatch yawning like a sigh that wouldn't end. He ducked inside and began the swift archaeology of crisis. Pry panels with a flat bar. Read the logic of a system without the language. Yank the black box equivalent from its cradle, and hope it thinks kindly of being handled by strangers. He found the beacon at last by its stubbornness, the only component still pinging in a band that his HUD could sniff. He freed it with as much grace as time allowed. He slotted in a data tap and let his implant record the outpouring, a monsoon of code, half of which his tools marked as unknown. He did not try to read meaning in the torrent. He took it like rain in a bucket and promised to sort it later. Back at the outpost, he set the beacon by the medbed. Liara touched it as if it were a friend's hand. Her fingers hovered over an embossed symbol, and it flushed briefly with pale light. She exhaled. Relief, prayer? He wasn't sure, but he said aloud, "To the room and the sky and the tiny part of the universe that might be listening, she's alive." He leaned against the counter and felt the day crash through him at last. The adrenaline had slid away. In its place was a tiredness with a strange shape, not depletion, but investment. He had poured himself into something that held. Liara watched him through the filaments. Her head tilted. "Orion," she said, and waited until he met her gaze. "You saved life." He shrugged, the human trick of minimizing the unbearable. "It's the job." She shook her head slowly. "Not job. Choice." She tapped the beacon, then her chest, then, lightly, the air between them. "Choice makes path," he wanted to argue. To say that protocol would have had any decent human do the same. To insist that he was not special. That circumstance had done its clumsy math, and he had only shown up with a calculator. Instead he nodded, because some arguments are a way of stepping away from the truth, and he did not want to take that step outside. The horizon cleared its throat and coughed up a strip of pale blue near the ground, the lower atmosphere doing a trick with light that never failed to make him feel like the planet was pulling aside a curtain to let him peek backstage. He thought, with sudden and shocking clarity, that his life had just split a seam, and that he had no business stitching it closed. Rest. He said gently. Tomorrow, he corrected himself. When you wake again, we'll try standing. A little. We'll see what you can tolerate. Liara's lids slid halfway down, then lifted, letting him know she had heard and filed it. She placed her palm against the bed, against the place where her body met the outpost's fabric, and held it there for a heartbeat. Connection, he thought, or gratitude, or ritual. He realized he would need a whole new vocabulary for these tiny acts. Good, she said. We see. He turned down the lights and sat. He let the outpost hum itself into evening. He let his mind, for once, not march ahead to plans and contingencies, but hover in the large room of the present. He saved one alien girl. It had hammered Aurora Station for 31 hours without pause, screaming winds, sheets of acid-laced rain, the kind of tempest that stripped paint from alloy and carved shallow scars into rock. Orion spent most of that time in a steady cycle of work and worry, repairing weather seals, recalibrating the scrubbers, watching Liara's vitals stabilize and plateau. By the time the skies cleared, the landscape looked scoured, as if the planet had shed a layer of skin. A copper-scented mist clung low to the ground, ghosting between jagged stone teeth. The outpost sensors crackled back to life one by one, and through the newly opened silence came something that did not belong there, a signal. At first Orion thought it was just system noise, the relay glitching, a ghost ping from some deep space satellite, but the frequency was too precise, the pattern too deliberate. It wasn't natural. It wasn't random. It was searching. Liara, he said quietly from the console, glancing back at her. She was sitting up now, swathed in a loose pressure wrap and insulated blanket. Her posture stronger, her skin a brighter violet glow. She had spent the last day teaching him fragments of her language, mostly names for objects and states of being, but the word for signal was one she had already known in. Standard signal, she repeated, eyes narrowing. From them, maybe, Orion said. It's tight-beamed and encrypted, coming from orbit. They're definitely not pirates. This is coordinated. For the first time since he'd met her, he saw real tension ripple through her body, not fear, but anticipation. The filaments crowning her head fanned out and trembled. Aryans, she whispered. Kin, Orion leaned closer. You think they're looking for you? They are, she said, with quiet certainty. They always look. If one is lost, they search. There was something deeper beneath those words, a cultural weight he didn't yet understand. It wasn't just rescue. It was obligation, woven into the bones of her people. He toggled the receiver, pinging the origin. The signal replied instantly, adjusting course toward his coordinates. Whoever was out there, they were coming, and fast. The Sky Open's first ship appeared at dawn on the third day. Orion stepped out onto the observation deck in his pressure suit, the cold wind biting even through the thermal layers. Liara stood beside him, leaning lightly on his arm for balance. She was still weak, but she insisted on seeing them arrive with her own eyes. At first there was nothing but a glint, a silver shard piercing the thin upper atmosphere. Then another, and another. Within minutes the sky was alive with light. Dozens of vessels broke through the clouds in a graceful, spiraling formation, not the harsh, angular bulk of human warships, but something altogether different. They were beautiful, long and slender, wings swept back like birds of prey, their surfaces iridescent, catching the thin sunlight and scattering it into rainbows. Trails of faint bioluminescent exhaust followed them, painting curling sigils across the heavens. Orion's breath caught. That's a fleet. Liara's lips curved upward, the first true smile he'd seen on her face. Not fleet, kin clan. The ships moved in perfect silence, descending not like conquerors, but like pilgrims. They formed a slow, deliberate ring above the outpost, and then, with a coordination that defied gravity and aerodynamics, they landed. The ground trembled under Orion's boots. As the first of them touched down barely 100 meters away, the air filled with a deep, resonant hum, not mechanical, but alive, as if the ships themselves were singing to the planet. Then the hatches opened. The Era emerged one by one, tall, elegant figures stepping lightly onto alien soil. Dozens of them, then scores. All women. Every one of them bore the same shimmering violet skin as Liara, the same translucent glow, though in varying hues, some deep indigo, others pale lavender shot through with luminous silver. They wore robes woven from fabric that looked like liquid starlight, patterns shifting and flowing as they moved. Some bore ornamental circlets on their foreheads, others intricate jewelry that hummed softly with hidden energy. But what struck Orion most was the way they moved, not with military precision, nor fearful caution, but with poised, deliberate grace. These were not soldiers. They were something else. Liara let go of his arm and took an unsteady step forward. The crowd parted like water, and from their midst one figure advanced, taller than the rest, her robes adorned with 1,000 tiny lights that pulsed like constellations. She carried herself with the serene weight of command. "Elindra," Liara whispered, voice trembling. "Matriarch." The woman stopped a few feet away and studied Orion in silence. Her eyes, the color of molten gold, seemed to see through him. Then she bowed, deeply, reverently. "Human," she said in flawless universal standard, her voice a lilting melody that seemed to vibrate in the air. "I am Elindra, matriarch of the Aryan kin clan Celis. You are the one who saved our daughter." Orion swallowed hard. Yes. I found her crash pod and treated her injuries." Elindra's gaze softened, and she straightened. "Then you have done more than you know." She turned to Liara and spoke in their native tongue, a series of harmonized tones that were as much song as speech. Liara responded with a bow of her own, then gestured toward Orion. "Matriarch says." She translated haltingly, "Your action binds our lives to yours." The life-death they gathered inside the outpost. A surreal sight, Orion's cramped, utilitarian habitat filled with luminous, otherworldly beings. Liara remained by his side, translating where she could, though Elindra seemed to understand more standard than she let on. They told him their story. The Aryans were a nomadic species, explorers, scientists, and diplomats whose fleets had been wandering the stars for millennia. Liara's ship had been ambushed by a band of pirate marauders near the border of Aryan territory. The attackers sought to ransom or enslave the crew, but Liara had initiated a fail-safe escape pod. It had hurled her light years away, across the black void, until gravity and fate had drawn her to Kepler 9-1b for days. They had searched for her, and now, thanks to Orion, they had found their lost kin. "You must understand," Elindra said, her voice gentle but firm. "Liara is a heirling, a member of our first line, chosen from birth to carry our ancestral memory and guide our people's future. Her survival is not merely personal. It is sacred." Orion blinked. "I didn't know. I just did what anyone would have done." The matriarch tilted her head slightly. "No, many would not have. Many would have feared her, or ignored her, or seen her as a resource to exploit. You did none of these. You acted with compassion, without knowledge, without reward." She gestured, and the gathered Aryans bowed in unison, dozens of them lowering their heads before him. "In our culture," Elindra continued, "to save a heirling's life is to become part of her kin bond. It is an oath as old as our species. The bond is not between savior and saved, but between families, between bloodlines." Orion felt his pulse quicken. "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means," the matriarch said, smiling faintly, "that you are now kin to us, and we, all of us, are bound to you." The gift of kinship next hours unfolded like a dream. Aryan engineers set up bioluminescent pylons around the outpost, turning the barren landscape into a glowing garden. Healers examined Liara with advanced bioinstruments that put Orion's medical suite to shame. Historians asked permission to record his voice and image for their archives. Even children, small, luminous beings with playful, fluid movements, darted around his feet, curious and unafraid. One group constructed a crystalline structure beside the outpost, a sort of ceremonial hall grown from self-assembling nanofibers. Within it, Elindra invited Orion to stand beside Liara beneath a suspended prism of living light. "This is the Selithron," she explained. "The binding rite. By saving Liara, you have become part of our story. We offer you the protection of our fleets, the knowledge of our libraries." And the loyalty of our people. Orion stared at the luminous circle surrounding him. Dozens of Aryan women, all watching silently, reverently. It was overwhelming. It was too much. I don't deserve this, he stammered. I just did what anyone would. Stop saying that, Liara interrupted softly. You did save me, and in our way, that means everything. She stepped closer and placed a hand, warm, delicate, glowing, over his heart. You are part of our kin now, and kin never walk alone. The hall erupted in a low, harmonic chant. It wasn't loud, but it seemed to resonate in the very bones of the planet. Orion felt the sound wrap around him, filling the spaces between his thoughts. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen. A new destineth at night. The outpost was transformed. It glowed under twin moons, surrounded by Aryan light towers and living structures that hummed gently in the wind. Orion sat on the roof, legs dangling over the edge, staring up at a sky filled with alien ships that now felt strangely comforting. Liara joined him, her steps light against the metal plating. She sat close, their shoulders brushing, a casual contact that felt anything but casual. You seem overwhelmed, she said gently. He laughed quietly. That's one way to put it. Yesterday I was a forgotten scientist on a dead rock. Now I'm apparently part of a spacefaring kin clan. Do you regret saving me? She asked. Never, he said without hesitation. But I don't know what this means. I'm not a leader. I'm not worthy of all this. Liara tilted her head, studying him with those luminous eyes. Worthiness is not the measure of destiny. Choice is choice. You chose to act, and now choices will unfold around that action. That is how all great stories begin. They sat in silence for a while, the wind carrying distant Aryan songs across the red plains. Somewhere above them, fleets prepared to depart. Somewhere far beyond, the galaxy turned unaware that a single human choice had just altered the course of two civilizations. Orion stared into the night sky and wondered what his life would become. He had saved one alien girl, and now an entire tribe of women stood at his door, not as strangers, but as kin. A thin veil of cirrus dust drifted high above the plains, catching the sun and breaking it into pale ladders that fell over Rora Station like a benediction. The Aryan structures grown crystals, living membranes, strands of luminous fiber had multiplied overnight, as if the planet had agreed to host them and then hurried to make room. Paths braided between domes and spires. Children ghosted along those paths in laughing currents, leaving wakes of glimmering pollen that the wind lifted and braided into the air. If Orion stood still, he could hear the place breathing. He'd been up since pre-dawn, the kind of wakefulness that comes not from rest, but from an excess of meaning. Pressing against the ribs, he had cleaned already clean counters, inventoried already counted supplies, brewed tea, and then let it go cold while he watched a team of Aryan engineers convince a slab of silica to curl into a bench. Liara found him exactly where he'd started on the observation deck, palms braced on the rail, jacket open to the thin, chill air. You're early, she said. Her voice had thickened with strength over the past days. It carried warmth now as well as music. Couldn't sleep, Orion admitted. Lots to think about. Liara leaned her hip against the rail beside him. She wore a simple robe close-fitting at the shoulders, loose at the waist, woven from that impossible fabric that caught light and let it go slowly. The wound at her side had become a pale crescent of glass under skin. When she moved, the filaments crowning her head lifted and fell like grass in a tide. The matriarch will come soon, she said. She asked that we walk before the right. She says ground underfoot makes steadier vows. Vows, Orion repeated, tasting the word as if it had new angles. I keep wondering how much I don't understand. Liara's mouth tilted. Most of it, she said, and her fingers brushed his lightly once, an honest acknowledgement. But you know the center. What center? That you saved me. That I asked to remain near you. That my kin recognized the shape of that choice and came to fit around it. She glanced sideways at him. Also that pirates are cowards and will come again. He huffed something like a laugh and something like a sigh. Right, that. They walked. The ground had learned softness from the Aryan gardeners, where the planet had been all angles and grit, beds of low, Bioluminescent plants now stitch the stubborn rock. When Orion asked, Liara told him their names, most of which the translator rendered as metaphors: sleep light, memory fern, soil song. The plants hummed faintly when brushed, an almost sound that vibrated in the teeth. They passed a cluster of healers singing around a membrane tank. Inside, a dense lattice was growing, an organ of some kind, spun like lace from molecules and intent. The healer's melody was not aesthetic. It was tool. The pitch mapped to chemical folds. Harmony coaxed alignment. Orion stopped and listened with his hands as well as his ears, his clinical mind making space for the way their science wore ritual like a comfortable coat. You could learn it, Liara said. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true. They circled to a new-grown pavilion near the station's east wall, open to the air. Its roof a net of glass threads that gathered sunlight and dripped it, slow and honey-thick, down the support pillars. Elindra waited inside that the matriarch stood as they approached. Two attendants unfolded from the shadows behind her like sentences finishing themselves. Elindra's presence had the density of a star wrapped in silk. When she inclined her head toward Orion, he felt the instinct to bow and did not argue with it. Orion Kale, she said, and somehow made his name sound like an instrument. We are ready to speak plainly. I'm grateful, he said. I'd like to understand what I'm agreeing to. Good, Elindra replied. Consent without comprehension is theater, she gestured, and a section of the pavilion floor unrolled itself into a low table. Four objects rested there, a clear bowl holding liquid that contained its own light, a thin spiral of crystal wound around a seed-dark core, a narrow band of metal like a bracelet, and a square of fabric so black it seemed to drink the day. These are the tokens of the Selithron, Elindra said. The binding rite, the bowl is truth shared openly. The spiral is memory shared faithfully. The band is responsibility worn with humility. The cloth is boundary respected without fail. Orion felt his attention ratchet up a notch. The shapes felt like more than symbol. They felt like tools. You talk about the bonding pact as kinship, he said. I keep thinking, treaty, alliance. I understand those. But this sounds closer. It is, Elindra said simply. Your species binds with documents because you have not yet learned to bind with songs. Liara's shoulder touched his. We can do both, she murmured. Elindra's eyes glittered with humor. Yes, we can. The matriarch poured a measure from the bowl into four small cups grown from the pavilion itself. The liquid sent a faint chorus into the air, notes so high Orion felt them more than heard them. This is not intoxicant, Elindra said, catching his glance. It is a conductor. It helps words reach the parts of the mind that sit in the dark and eavesdrop. You will need those parts listening. They drank. The liquid tasted like clean water until it didn't. Until it tasted like the first breath after a storm. And the moment a scalpel's curve becomes an extension of the hand that holds it. Orion exhaled. The world came into crisper focus. Tell him the costs, Liara said quietly. Tell him all of them. The humor left Elindra's face like a tide pulling back over rock. She folded her hands. First, she said, the pact is not romantic. It allows love. It does not require it. Its first bond is duty. To answer when kin calls, to shelter when kin flees, to tell the truth when lies are soft. Second, the pact carries weight among our people. If you accept the title of guardian, your voice will be heard in councils where species decide their paths. You will be given access to our libraries and our courts. The cost is time. We will call upon it without apology. Third, hazard. We protect our own. Our enemies learn that lesson by test. The pirates who hunted Liara will smell this bond and learn to fear it or break themselves on it. There will be moments when you will stand in a doorway and choose which way the fire runs. Fourth difference. You will live in a braid of cultures. Sometimes the weave will hold. Sometimes it will kink and snag and cut. We will make mistakes. So will you? She held his gaze, not unkindly. Lastly, permanence. The pact endures until death, and some say after. We do not rescind it, even when we are angry. We do not sell it. We do not forget. The pavilion had fallen quiet around her voice. Outside, the wind combed the new gardens. A ship lifted in the distance, rose like a thought, and became a bright seam in the sky. Orion listened for the place inside himself that made decisions, and found it already leaning. Fear made itself known, its honest inventory, dangers, obligations. The inconvenient fact that his life had been small by choice and would not fit back into that frame. If he stepped forward now, he let fear speak. Then he let it sit down and share the table with other guests. Curiosity, duty, the clean joy of competent hands meeting worthy work. And yes, something that felt like the first chapter of a story he would be sad not to read. Who was Guardian before? He asked, because sometimes the shape of a role shows in the silhouette of those who wore it. Ilindra's mouth softened at the edges. The last was a Vasari mathematician who taught our singers a new harmony for repairing damaged latticework in young minds. Before that, a human linguist who lived and died among us 2 centuries ago. Before that, a pair of bonded miners who made a corridor through an asteroid so our ships could pass and then stayed to keep it true. What happened to them? They were mourned, Ilindra said, and remembered. The pack does not keep death away. It keeps life company. Liara reached for the spiral on the table. Her fingers hovered just above it. We can show you a piece, she said quietly. Not lower, not the whole weight, just a thread. How? Orion asked, already knowing the answer would be stranger than anything he'd trained for and already wanting it. Liara's filaments lifted, then settled like a creature bracing for the ocean. Through touch, she said. The spiral will help. You can refuse. Orion did not refuse. He lifted his hand. Liara set the spiral between his palm and hers. It felt cool, and then not, smooth, and then full of microscopic ridges that found lines in his skin. He expected words. What came was image. A hall that was also a throat, swallowing light. A child listening to an elder sing the names of stars and hearing, for the first time, that stars have names for us too. A ship's wing folding like a living thing, and the sound that meant safe passage. A woman young, fierce laughing as she raced another along a rope bridge spun between towers of glass coral, while far below a city thrummed. Liara's memories came braided with something else, not the spiral, but the point where her story intersected with what might be future. She showed him a settlement on a red world that was not this one, where human children ran under Aryan lights. She showed him a meeting room grown from crystal and argument. She showed him a small metal band the same as the one on the table, resting against the inside of his wrist, warm from skin, scuffed from use, and not unwelcome. When he let go, he had tears in his eyes and salt on his tongue, and a sudden, precise grief for all the versions of himself that would never now exist. Okay, he said, and the word had the grain of a vow even before the rite made it one. Okay. Ilindra's attendants moved quietly, the way competent people do when the moment matters. The pavilion shifted its bones. A low circle rose from the floor, ringing the for tokens. A breeze found its way through and plucked the strands in the roof. The pavilion answered with a low, welcoming chord. Stand here, Ilindra said. Both of you. Liara took his hand. The contact felt simple. It was not. The matriarch's voice took on that ceremonial cadence that belongs to weddings and funerals and oaths. Let truth be poured between you, she said, and lifted the bowl. The liquid made for descending notes as she tipped it into the air. The drops did not fall. They wove themselves into a thin, shining thread that hung between Orion and Liara like a question mark, straightened into an exclamation point. Let memory be braided, she said, and wrapped the thread around the crystal spiral. Light moved along the coil in small, precise pulses. The way a nerve tells a muscle it is time to act. Let responsibility be worn, she said, and lifted the band. Wait, Orion said, sudden, surprised at his own interruption. Before I wear anything, I need to ask, what does guardian mean in practice? Day to day, Ilindra did not look offended. If anything, she looked relieved. You will be a hinge, she said. When doorways open between us and yours, you will stand there and help traffic pass without crushing. You will read and be read. Orion woke to silence, not the empty silence of solitude, but the hushed stillness of a community, still asleep, breathing together. Aurora Station was no longer his alone. The spires the Aryans had raised during the night glowed faintly in the violet dawn, humming with energy. Where once his view had been nothing but barren rock and scoured valleys, The horizon now glittered with crystalline domes, bioluminescent gardens, and landing craft shaped like wings at rest. For a moment he wondered if he had died in the storm, and this was some afterlife conjured out of his own loneliness. But then Liara stirred beside the console where she had dozed, her luminous skin rising and falling with steady breath, and the dream sharpened into reality. The world had changed, and so had he. The settlement be midday. Kepler 91b was alive. Aryan engineers sang structures out of raw mineral dust, weaving it into living crystal that thrummed faintly when touched. Healers brewed tinctures from alien flora and showed Orion how their harmonics could slow bleeding or coax cell repair. Children darted between the gardens, their laughter carried on the thin wind. The human outpost, once a lonely shell of recycled modules, was now the heart of a growing settlement. They named it Solace Hold, though the Aryan translation meant something closer to Nest Between Stars. Orion walked the new streets with Alindra and Liara. Everywhere he looked, the Aryans bowed their heads to him, not with the rigid respect of soldiers, but with a softer, familial reverence. He had not just earned their gratitude. By their law, he was kin. It unsettled him and steadied him in equal measure. "You built this in a day," he murmured, marveling at a crystal tower that rippled like frozen water. "We spend years just trying to terraform." Elindra's smile was kind but carried an edge of pride. "Where humans move stone, we teach stone to move itself. Where you fight the soil, we coax it to listen." Different gifts. Together they may be stronger. That word "together" hung between them like a seed waiting for rain. The first test that night, the celebration began. The pavilion where the bonding rite had been held became the center of the feast. Bioluminescent fruits burst with sweet mist when cracked. Veins of living crystal were coaxed to glow in patterns, painting the floor with light. The Aryans sang in layered harmonies that made Orion's skin shiver, voices weaving through each other like threads of silk. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a solitary figure on the edge of the galaxy. He felt part of something, but the celebration was broken by the sharp ping of the orbital sensors. Orion froze as red warnings spilled across the holoscreen. 3 incoming vessels. Their vector was fast, direct, and uncoordinated. The signature was unmistakable. Pirates. The memory of Liara's torn pod snapped through him. Elindra rose immediately, her robes whispering like flame. They followed her trail. "They will not leave without blood." The Aryans' voices hushed. Children were pulled back. Guards unfurled weapons that shimmered with refracted light. For a moment, Orion expected panic. Instead, there was only quiet readiness, like a tide pulling back before a wave. He looked at Liara. She met his gaze calmly, though her filaments trembled faintly. "Guardian," she said softly, reminding him of the title the Pact had given him. It was not a question. It was a summons. The Guardian's choicest pirate ships broke atmosphere minutes later. They were ugly, angular, patched with scavenged parts and blackened by burns. Orion recognized the type, old haulers gutted and rebuilt for raiding. They circled once like vultures and then descended. The lead ship crackled with an amplified voice, "Hand over the airling. We'll spare the rest." The demand made Orion's blood boil, not because it threatened him but because it reduced Liara to a commodity. He opened the comm. "This isn't a negotiation. Leave now." Static hissed, then cruel laughter. "A human playing protector?" Orion didn't answer with words. He triggered the beacon Elindra had pressed into his hand after the rite. The ground around the settlement pulsed with stored resonance. The pylons the engineers had planted sang awake, weaving their harmonics into a shimmering shield that enveloped the entire colony. The pirates' weapons fired, bolts of crude plasma hammering the barrier. The shield rippled but held. The Aryans did not rush to attack. Instead, they began to sing. Their voices rose in unison, tones precise, layered, and resonant. The shield brightened with each chord, absorbing energy and feeding it back in waves. Orion's HUD registered an impossible surge. The barrier wasn't just defense, it was alive, adapting, amplifying. The pirates' second volley fizzled against it. The third was reflected outright, slamming back into their own flank. Orion stood at the edge of the pavilion, his voice shaking but firm as he spoke into the comm. "This is not prey. This is not a prize. This world is protected. These people are my kin." Leave now, or you won't leave at all. Silence. Then, slowly, the raiders turned tail, limping back toward the sky. The Aryan's song softened into a sigh, the shield dimming like a lantern at dawn. When quiet returned, Orion realized his hands were trembling not from fear, but from the raw weight of what had just happened. He had stood, and they had stood with him, a new horizon when the danger passed. Elindra gathered the clan once more in the glowing hall. "You see now," she said, her voice carrying to every corner. "The pact is not symbolic, it is real. Today, a guardian stood between us and the void. Today, we did not bend. Today, we began a new world." Her gaze swept the crowd, then settled on Orion. "This settlement will grow, a bridge between Aryan and human. It will not be easy, but no great thing is." She lifted her hand, and the others mirrored her. From one life saved, 1,000 paths open. The chant that followed was not loud, but it seemed to resonate with the bones of the planet itself, a promise sung into stone. Later, under the quiet of twin moons, Orion and Liara walked together along the new-built paths. "Do you regret it?" she asked him softly. Taking the pact, becoming guardian, Orion looked up at the ships glittering above, at the glowing gardens, at the laughter that still echoed faintly from the settlement. He thought of the years he had spent alone, chasing data no one cared about, speaking to no one but himself. He thought of the moment he had lifted her from the wreckage, fragile and dying, and the way her eyes had opened to him. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it. Saving you didn't just change my life, it changed everything." Liara's smile glowed faintly in the moonlight. Then everything was worth it. They walked on in silence, to figures outlined in violet and silver light. Behind them, a new civilization stirred, born not from conquest or greed, but from a single choice of compassion. Above them, the stars turned. For the first time, Orion felt not like an observer of their endless dance but a part of it. He had saved one alien girl, and in doing so, he had opened the door to a future neither species could have imagined. A dawn had come not just for him, but for a new world.